I just moved out here about a little over a year ago. My wife and daughter and I moved out from Ithaca, New York. I was a professor at Cornell for a long time. But one of the reasons that we were excited to move out here was to connect more with people in the Valley. And what I study basically is how people behave on the internet or through any communication technology. So I'll be leaving tomorrow for LA for the first ever Psychology of Technology conference that we've put together, and that's sort of the space that I work in. How does technology interact with psychology? One of the takeaway messages from today is that we don't throw out the book of psychology just because people are interacting with tech. But it's very easy to forget about that. And so today I'm going to do much more on the social science side of things. It's a general level talk, but I know there's a lot of deep technical expertise here, so feel free to ask me questions anytime on any of the studies or things like that. But I'm going to keep it at a fairly high level. And we're going to look at essentially how is it this very old thing about deception and trust bumps up to technology. How does technology change the way that we lie and tell the truth? And there's lots of like silly little ways you can imagine. So here's like a classic sort of Snapchat where the person's saying like, this is the best Snapchat I've ever done, and it looks like they're chilling by the pool, when in fact the person just has their fingers up against a monitor and they've taken a little snap, right? So it's sort of fun. You see these kind of playful deceptions all the time. One of the big concerns with online consumer business now is reviews. They're massively relied upon, and almost every person, when we poll people like, do you have any concerns about online reviews, the number one concern people have is fake reviews. And companies deal with fake reviews on a pretty continuous basis. And they can even go much bigger. So this is one of my favorite technology deceptions in the last couple of years. How many people are familiar with the VW crisis, right? It's insane. It's amazing. They engineered a car to tell when it was being tested, and then it changed its behavior, basically. And not just one car, but millions of them. So this is a really good example of engineers designing tech into designing deception into tech at scale. It's really fascinating. And so with all these examples, and the fact that, I don't know if you guys noticed, but there's a presidential election going on. Yeah. So there's one going on, and the topic of deception has come up as an issue once or twice.
Does that have anything to do with the meeting movie from last night?
Yeah. Well, we'll talk about that tonight. So we did a big project with CNN that just came out this week on sort of the science of lying in politics. And I'll tell you about an op-ed I wrote recently about my take on a puzzle with this election, which is that one of the candidates actually makes many, many more false statements than pretty much any other candidate, but is perceived as equally trustworthy and honest as the other candidate. And you can probably guess which way that goes. And with all this in the air, it feels sometimes that like we're more deceptive than ever. And I get this a lot when I give general talks, that it feels like this generation's more deceptive than prior generations. And because of that feeling, the thing that's also salient in the world, like technology, social media, often gets blamed for that. But it's really important to actually put it in some context. It turns out every generation that we've been able to measure, so going back about 60 years, thinks that the previous generations were more honest than the current generation. It seems to be a constant. And not just going back, decades, we can go back pretty far into human history. Here's Diogenes. Anybody know what he's looking for with his lantern? A single honest man, and he died without finding one, the story goes. It's a really uplifting tale. But we can see here that even the Greeks around 2,000 years ago were really deeply worried that their current generation was more deceptive than prior ones. And it's not just in Western culture. The first documented instance of a lie detection system was by the Chinese. They'd place rice in the suspected liar's mouth, assuming that their arousal levels would decrease their saliva and they wouldn't be able to talk. And that's about 2,000 years old as well. So real deep concerns about deception, and it dates back before social media even. My own sort of interaction with deception was as a customs officer, as Ash said. That's in the mid-90s there, and it may look like that's my weapon, but in fact, it's a stamp. That is how we in Canada defend our borders against all the Americans. The other thing to note in this photo is that telephone there. So this was one of the first years in which boaters could come up to a number of docks that were unmanned on the British Columbia coast and call in to see if they could be cleared. And so I would ask them, whether they had any weapons and how much alcohol they had, obviously if there's any contraband, those sort of things. And I remember the whole agency being freaked out. Like, what? Like, how can we tell if this person's lying to us? We're on the phone. And so it was a very early instance for me of how technology was going to affect trust and deception. So before we get too much further in, I want to be clear about how I define lying. And it's basically got two parts. You're trying to mislead someone. What does it mean to mislead someone? You're trying to create a false belief in someone else. And a false belief is a belief that you believe to not be true. Okay? So you are trying to get somebody else to believe something that you know not to be true. And you have to do that intentionally, because we can often get people to believe things that aren't true, but that's just a mistake, right, if you're not doing it intentionally. All right. So whenever you have questions like, well, would this be deception or would that, then that's the thing to hold on to. Lies of omission tend to be one of the biggest, most common forms of lying, but there's a whole range. And I'm going to talk about lies in general, but I'm happy to take questions about specific ones as well. And I thought I'd start off with telling you about some of the lies that my lab has sort of been documenting over the last decade or so that seem to be really related to technology. And some of them have cute names, like the butler, the sock puppet, and the Chinese water army. And so we'll start with the butlers. Has anybody ever received a text on my way? Then you've been lied to, because almost never are people actually on their way. It is also the only text message that's shipped with the iPhone. So if you look, there's actually a lie buried right into the phone. So yes, sometimes people are on their way, but when we ask people to record all the texts over the last, say, 3 days, we get them to identify all the lies in their own texts and explain them. On my way is almost always rated as a lie. Another common one is something like, sorry, my phone is dead, right? So this is when you're trying to account for not responding to somebody. Or getting out of a conversation. All of these have in common this deceptive aspect around what is called micro-coordination. And micro-coordination is a sort of trying to get together with other people. And the reason that they're important is once you have my digits, you can basically call me literally any time, right? And I may really like you. So where's Ash? Over there. So like Ash, I like Ash, seems like a really nice guy, but maybe when he calls me or texts me, I just don't want to talk to him at that moment. I still like him, I still like our relationship. And so it puts people into a little bit of a difficult position. Technology has been designed with the goal of making communication between two people as easy and clear and with as much potential as possible. So people, I think, are creating a sort of social buffer that's designed to try and protect both themselves and their relationships. So that's one example where we see technology sort of shaping the way people lie. Oh, and you feel free to shout out questions anytime.
There's a question over here.
Okay.
Why is it called a butler?
Oh, why is it called a butler? Yeah, good one. So we're thinking about the idea of the butler who would open the door and ask who it was, and then close the door, basically, right? And go back and check with the master or the mistress and say, here's who it is. And they would say, let them in or tell them I'm otherwise occupied. And we went back and found a book for butler training dating to 1827. And there's a chapter on how butlers should do this very act. Yeah. So it's a butler lie, or we could call it a buffer lie, some similar idea. Another instance is around these kind of things like reviews. So here's a book by R.J. Ellery. I haven't read it, but this guy, Nicodemus Jones, has, and he's really keen on it. You can see that he says very positive things like, whatever else it might do, it will touch your soul. It's a good one. If you want to leave a review for this talk, feel free to use that terminology. As you might have guessed, those are the same people. And Nicodemus Jones was R.J. Ellery. He was outed by a journalist, and then there was a spate of these where many authors got caught promoting their own books. And actually there was about 400 authors in the UK signed a manifesto saying we shouldn't do this, like you needed to have a manifesto to say this is wrong. But this is a very common sort of concern. It's not necessarily due to technology. I mean, it's using this idea of identity deception, but Walt Whitman was sort of infamous for doing this as well. So it's not brand new, but technology does make it easier. And we can see this sort of identity deception aspect at scale when we think about the Chinese water army, or it's often referred to here in the US as astroturfing. This is where you pay people, many people, small amounts of money to do things for you. One example is fake reviews. There's been dozens of studies now showing people paying individuals to write fake reviews. My colleague in the comm department at Stanford analyzed about 500,000 emails that were leaked from Chinese prefecture and learned how the Chinese water army, or the 50-cent army, works. Most of the people that are writing propaganda for the Chinese on social media are actually Chinese government employees. And their job includes sort of like a small byline, which part of their weekly duties are to just talk about how positive and awesome China is, right? So it's written right in, yeah.
I have friends who live in China who indicate that you can buy Twitter followers in China.
Yes, well, so this whole issue of being able to buy followers, buy people to like your page, is a huge underground market for all of these things. Yeah, it's a very big issue. And in China, we see it as like you can buy these things, you have followers. The Chinese government is using them to promote China. Other countries have been shown to be using it to alter other countries' politics. So Russia has been identified as the ones hacking the WikiLeaks. But they're also using a lot of social media sock puppets to try and influence other countries' discussions. So they're using this sort of to do that. Yeah.
How are they detected? Is there automated ways of?
Yeah, so there's a number of groups working on bot detection now. So one group is out of the Oxford Internet Institute. And with their latest project, they've identified what they say is about 400 Twitter robots that work on behalf of the Donald Trump's purposes. So not saying that Donald Trump is involved at all, or the campaign's involved. But whenever something controversial comes out with Trump, then these accounts get activated and they look to be bot-like. There's a really great group out of Illinois in the computer science department that's working on bot detection as well. And obviously companies like Facebook work pretty tirelessly at this. So things like social network bots are really difficult to fake. So you can identify those fairly well. Yeah. Great. So given all the things I just showed you, it's also easy to think that perhaps all technology does is sort of facilitate deception, and that technology has this ability to change it. But what I want us to do is show you some studies that we've done in my lab that tell a little bit of a different story, actually. And so what I want to do is focus on a particular kind of communication, not the kind with the Nigerian prince or Twitter bots or anything like that, because those are fairly obvious, but rather the communication with coworkers, families, and friends. They make up over 90% of all of your online interactions in a day. And so what happens when we have those interactions? Let me just see what you guys think in terms of where we might lie the most. Do you guys think that we lie the most face-to-face, on the telephone, or in email? We'll just use those three media for now. Where do you think lying occurs the most? And let's say that we could control for how frequently you communicate in those three media. So controlling for communication frequency, where do you think people lie the most? How many people think face-to-face? One strong believer, 2.5, 3, 4, 5, some confidence building. Okay, good, 5-ish. How many people think that the phone is the place where people like talking on the phone? Okay, many more, probably about half. And how many people think email? All right, so there's the other half. All right, good. So those of you that said face-to-face, why? Why did you think face-to-face?
Because you always try to go on and zero in on the guy you're talking to. I want you to like me. I want you to go on and feel nice. Even if your talk is crap, I'm not going to tell you that to your face.
Right. Okay, yeah, so actually being in front of the other person is really valuable because you can see how they're reacting to your deception. You can change tack if it looks like the person's becoming suspicious. And that's a very good argument in the literature.
You should probably communicate more, face-to-face than using the phone and emails, anyway.
You communicate more face-to-face?
Yeah.
But you said
That's true, but let's say we can control for that. Yeah, so, and the study I'll tell you the results about in a second, we had people record all their face-to-face interactions, all their interactions, and then they indicated what media, and then whether they lied or not. And so then we can take the number of lies and divide by how often they interacted in that media. Yeah. How about phone? Why do people think the phone? So people that said phone, why did you think it was where people are the most?
The voice is such an easily changed kind of media that you don't see what their facial expression is or what they're doing or anything else.
So no cues,
Yeah.
right? So you can use your voice.
And email is more permanent also. So the lies you tell on the phone are there temporarily and then they're gone.
Very good. So right now I'm guessing most of the email people are like, oh crap, right? Yes.
So are you normalizing for the scale or the type of lie?
We have done that, and these results hold up. But I'm just talking about on average, and they're daily. The distribution, if you say 1 is like a small little lie, and 5 is like, if I got caught, this would be bad, I could go to jail, my wife would leave me, that kind of thing. The distribution is very much skewed, right? So most of our lies are in the like 1 to 3 range. Yeah. Yes.
I think the email is, you can be so premeditated. You can really, really figure it all out.
Plan it out, right? Yeah, that's a really good way to think about it. I think timing actually is important.
Actually, many of the email and email style of interactions are institutionalized. So, for example, if you apply for a job, the courteous letter that comes back, the letter that ties you down, very rarely has a grain of truth in it.
Right.
And if you're on Facebook and you like a posting, you often like posting because you want the person not to be upset, or to show that you're interested in them, not because you're interested in their particular posting.
And I don't think that's lying. So that I think we could separate that out, because they're not trying to mislead the person so that they think that you actually like that. They're just like, okay, good, the person paid attention to it. And we could quibble on that, but maybe, maybe not. So when we look at it across the media where you're interacting, and rather than just doing reactions, phone is where repeatedly we see the most lies. And I think it has actually nothing to do with the cues, but we'll dive into that, and I could be wrong there. I think that it has something to do with planning, but it's actually the opposite of the way you say it. A lot of our lies, like you were getting at, that there are different kinds of lies. Many of the lies are due to spontaneity. A lot of lies come down because you're in a bind, right? Normally, the truth is usually the easiest thing to do, but sometimes it becomes problematic. So if I were to ask you guys like what you thought of my shoes and whether they go with my outfit, and you're like, they don't, but you don't want to insult me, you might say a lie, right? Whereas in email, you're absolutely right, you have time to plan things. Often people can come up with ways of saying something that's not a lie, but also doesn't insult the person or doesn't trap them in something else. So the main thing that somebody said here was about the permanence of email, and that is the #1 problem. In fact, if you think about any political scandal over the last 15 years, right? Even with the Trump thing, it's a recording. And I think in many ways, politicians are the canary in the coal mine for us. Much more of what they do and say is recorded than ours, even though we're becoming more and more recorded. But probably within, small n number of years, 10-ish, most things we say and do will be recorded by some device that we have, right? And so that record is changing the way that we lie and tell the truth. So, very briefly, I'll just show you that, and I didn't put up all the full results, and I'm happy to share with Carl or Ash all of the papers that I'll be referring to in this, so those of you who want to do a deeper dive can jump in. But, about a fifth of face-to-face conversations will contain some sort of like falsehood, and it jumps way up for the telephone. And email tends to be much lower than both. This has been replicated outside of our lab in different countries. Email between known individuals tends to be a little bit more honest, and part of that is because of that concern about the record, I think. But some of these other features as well. Yes?
So the other thing is, have you controlled for the type of information being communicated? Because I can imagine there are tons of work emails between people who know each other, where that type of communication no longer goes on.
Oh yeah, we can definitely dive in, and it absolutely matters. In fact, a big problem for a lot of deception research is just being too general, considering deception sort of sui generis. So if you're talking with work colleagues, then social things tend to be more what you lie about, like whether you want to hang out with them afterwards or not. Whereas lying to your work colleagues in email about work things is a terrible idea, and people tend to avoid that. But lying to your parents or your family on the phone is where they do all of it, right? So that's the place where they tend to lie on the phone. So there's definitely, you can think of it as a matrix, and we can show how the kind of person you're talking to, the relationship, and the topic is affected by the medium. So the medium seems to shape those sorts of things. But if we control for all that and we average across everything, this is what you find. Yeah. Yes?
Is this still self-reporting, that I lied on this, or
Yeah.
some kind of external? I mean, is that a
Yeah.
factor in terms of skewing your numbers?
Right. No, that's the number one criticism that Reviewer 2 gives us all the time. So we're asking people to be honest about their deceptive behavior, right? And we were very nervous about this for a long time, and I'll talk about this in the next study that we go into, because I think actually people can be honest about their deception. Here's another one we did where we created a job, and people could apply for that job either through LinkedIn or through a paper resume. This is 2012. And, pardon me?
You were lying, this wasn't a job?
No, there was a job. Thank you. We have done another one where there was no job. It was just like, we can do that, like an audit survey. And we asked about 40 headhunters in New York, like where they thought more lying would take place, and they all said, obviously in LinkedIn, because it's online and everything bad happens online. And sure enough, what we found was the number of lies were about the same. But in LinkedIn, most of the lies got pushed down into things like hobbies and interests. And in paper resumes, the more frequent lies were in what your responsibilities at your last job were, how long you worked there, your skill sets. And so those are the things that most employers actually care about. Now, why would this medium, LinkedIn, shape lies like this? They move them, people still lied, but they moved them into these other areas, interests and hobbies.
I'll suggest that technology allows you to go check it out.
Well, so that's basically it when it comes down to it. LinkedIn is a network, and your network is the number one constraint on deception. And the reason for that is the people that actually know the truth are in your network, and the people for whom you care about how they think about you are your network. And so actually lying in network spaces can be very risky, and people tend to constrain themselves when doing that. It's one of the reasons why when people often talk about Facebook being super deceptive, that I argue that it's not, and we have lots of evidence that it's not. We get people to look at the personality of an individual. They only get to look at their Facebook page, or they got to meet them and talk to them for 3 minutes. And the people that look at the Facebook page are just as accurate at the personality assessment as the people that get to meet them face to face, when we compare it to how a friend that's known the person for years judges them. Okay? So I don't think that just because you're online, you're going to be more deceptive. Instead, it's all about the psychological aspects of why you lie and why you don't lie. And lying in front of friends that can detect you is extremely high risk behavior.
But there's a presumption that it's networked.
There's a presumption that it's networked, so that that Facebook is networked, or
If you have no friends.
well, yeah, then you would have a very lonely time on Facebook.
The question comes up is whether or not the way you stated it was truth expressed. And the answer is the mitigating factor, the thing that goes on and moves it back towards truthiness is in fact,
Not truthiness, because that's a different thing.
okay, truthfulness.
There you go.
Is the network effect
Right.
you're arguing.
Yeah, right. And we actually do see people that report having more real-world friends as part of their network on Facebook. Their profiles tend to be considered more honest, more authentic, more accurate. Yes?
But you don't seem to be taking into account the existence of narcissists, sociopaths, psychopaths, people for whom the intent to mislead is perhaps somewhat different than the average person.
Well, I do study psychopaths, and we've been looking at them a lot. We've looked at people in maximum security prison. We've been looking at it online and social media. They do talk differently. They do definitely lie more. But two interesting things. One, psychopaths make up about 0.5 to maybe 1.5% of the population. So there's probably one in the room. Hello. And they do interact differently online. So they tend to be highly manipulative, super charismatic. And we've been doing some work with some colleagues at UBC where if you're doing a negotiation task, like an economic game, face-to-face with a psychopath, they're going to typically get more out of you than you'll get out of them. And then you get them to do it in a text-based chat environment, and you outperform them. So for whatever reason, we think it has to do with their nonverbalness. The text environment actually undermines their ability to manipulate and deceive other people. In terms of narcissism, you're absolutely right that like narcissism is an issue. It's been on the rise, but it started increasing in the late 70s, early 80s. And that's before social media. So I do think that something in our society's changed and it leads to more narcissistic values, but I don't think it's anything to do with technology. I think it's to do with the emphasis we place on probably like material goods and things like that rather than social media. Great questions, you guys. All right, let's take a look at dating. And the reason dating is cool is because what we can do is look at what they say online and then ground truth. It goes to Carl's question of like, but how do you know these are really lies? So one cool thing about online dating is you have to say, for example, how tall you are. And what we did in New York City is we brought people into the lab the day after we scraped their profile. And so we can basically look at how tall they said they were on their profile and then measure them up against the wall and see how tall they are in the real world. So we have ground truth. And so this line here is the truth line, so to speak, the accurate line. And if the dot is below it, then they are lying on their profile by saying that they're taller than they actually were. And most of the men, as you can see here, lie about it, right? It's almost, I think it's something like about 75% are below the line. Now, a couple interesting things to notice about that. The distance away from the line is about 9/10 of an inch, okay? It's what my lab group calls strong rounding up, all right? So you're 5'7" and 1/10, okay, 5'8". You know, you just got to get across that thing there. And in addition to being frequent, it's subtle. That's the other thing, right? And if most of the men took a look at their shoes, most men's shoes have a heel in them that's about somewhere between ½ an inch to an inch, right? Why do men lie about their height really systematically? When we look at women, their height totally varies at random around the truth line. Why do men lie about their height? Is it because technology is causing them to do it?
Access to more women because men like to date women that are short.
No.
Women like to date men.
Women like to date men that are taller, right? So there's an evolutionary psychology argument that women are attracted to taller men. It goes back in time to the cave. The bigger, taller guy is more likely to bring back the resources, okay? And if you look at popular vote in most presidential elections, the taller man has a probability of winning at like 0.89. We can look at women and weight because they don't differ on height. And what we can see here is same. Here's how heavy they said they were in their profile, which is no longer asked after our study came out. And this is how heavy they actually were. So lines above are heavier. We see a different pattern. First of all, it is systematic, like the men were all below. But the women aren't doing it all at the same level, so we see an increase. The larger the women's body, the more they would lie about how heavy they are. Okay? Men were very different. They regressed towards the mean. So yes, big, heavy guys would say they were lighter than they were, but skinny little dudes, they would lie and say they were heavier, right? So there's a regression thing, whereas this is quite different. Now, why would women lie about their weight? They tended to lie much more about body issues. So you can look at their photos. You can look at like how old the photo was when it was taken. So women tend to post photos that are much younger versions of themselves. Why would we see this? Is it the technology doing it? What's that?
Culture.
Culture. Well, it's partly that men are bad people. So men prefer younger women. And there's this hourglass figure that is described in poetry going back to about the 15th century. So it's a very old phenomenon where men are attracted to this like thinner, younger hourglass figure. And there's again an evolutionary psychology argument for that, which is one of fertility. And so that seems to be that men and women are behaving on the internet with deception in exactly the way you would predict if technology wasn't involved.
I assume your group was mostly white because Black, Latino communities may view it a different direction.
This was primarily white, and it was small enough that we wouldn't be able to break down the demographics on that. But when OkCupid analyzed their whole dating universe, which I think was over 1 million daters, fit exactly what we were finding in the lab. Yeah. So men tend to have about an inch taller than the.
Men would go that direction, but women, there's a.
Women were it was the same pattern. Certainly, but.
Women don't have enough meat on them.
Right. So you could be right. You could be right. And the point there is that it's not about the technology necessarily, right? It's about our general psychological preferences. Yeah.
Two things about the male side. Well, one, there was Van Mango, I think, was accused of doing extreme rounding in their movie ratings to, this is a good movie to go see.
Right.
And isn't it for height? Isn't there like an inch amount of settling from when you wake up to late in the day or something?
Yeah. Tell yourself whatever you need to, Carl. No. Yes. So there is there. Right. There is variance. There's also variance in weight, and if it was just variance and people are like, there's a foggy mirror and we don't know how tall and how heavy we are, then you would see random error around that line, and we see systematic error.
You said that it probably doesn't depend on technology, so did you observe the same behavior prior to the existence of online dating?
Yeah, definitely, absolutely. So this is still technology, but there was a study that inspired ours in the early 90s looking at online dating used to take place in newspapers. They had personal ads and saw the exact same phenomena there. So newspapers are a tech, but it's not like, high tech. Yeah.
The same thing for age?
We did, yes. So we got their driver's license, and we found no difference between men and women. We predicted that women would lie more about their age. Now, why do you think we would see no difference?
Because they all lied about their age.
No, good question. Very few, very, very few. Both men and women, hardly anybody lied about their age. A couple did. Most did not. Right, so there's verifiability is a big important one. Like if Carl tells me he's 5'9", I'm down with that. Like that looks about right. But with the age, if he lied by a year on either side, it'd be like, what? You said you were like a different age. The other thing is when we did a big interview study with some daters, things like age were considered deal breakers. So that felt like a promise had been broken. That and relationship status, education, income, those things were considered deal breakers. And men lied much more about their education status, they lied more about their income, lied more about their jobs. And women found that not okay. And whereas men would find, lying about age was not all right for women. Yeah. Great questions. So let's jump ahead to what it means to actually what it means to lie, right? So here's Pinocchio. And in order to understand how people lie online, I think it's important to understand how people lie in the real world. So let's do an experiment. You need to choose a partner. So everybody choose a partner. Somebody you know, somebody you don't know. Why don't you reach out, meet another ACM member. Everybody got a partner? All right. Does anybody need a partner? Anybody need a partner? All right, now pick the person with the lighter colored shirt. Which of you has a lighter colored shirt? Great. That is not the experiment. When I lived in New York, I did this in New York City, and it didn't work because everyone was wearing black. So that's good. Now, I want the person that's the lighter colored partner, the lighter colored shirt partner, I want you to think about a trip you went on recently, okay? That's your job. For the dark colored shirts, I need you to close your eyes. This is a trust exercise. Trust us. Close your eyes.
Right now?
Yes, right now. And remember, I say deception. If you peek, I will find you and embarrass you in front of everybody. So keep your eyes closed until I explicitly tell dark shirts to open their eyes. I'll explicitly say it. So keep your eyes closed. All right, light colored shirts. You have some instructions. Okay. All right. Dark colored shirts, thank you very much. Open your eyes. Light colored shirts, please tell your partner about a trip you went on recently. Were you left out there, Greg? Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
You can listen in. Listen in on this one. Tell your story to both of these guys. You can say whatever you like. Yeah.
You're telling a story. When you may or may not. That's why you're supposed to. That's why we shy. Well, yeah, that's. This is why you don't
Okay, 30 seconds, and so start wrapping it up. All right, great. Thank you guys for sharing your stories. Thank you. So now, dark colored shirts, it's your job now to tell if that person was lying to you. Okay, this is a non-interrogation deception detection task. I want you to think back to what you just experienced. And you're going to try and make a decision. I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you think the person was lying to you. Okay, raise your hand and keep them up, please. All right, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4 on this side. Okay? Keep them up. Keep them up. All right, so those were the instructions. So the people with their hands up on this side of the room are correct. Everybody else is wrong. People with their hands up on this side of the room are mean, evil, cynical, nasty people. Okay, you can put your hands down. Thank you so much. Now, a few things to notice. First of all, it's very weird to lie to each other, so afterwards, you should talk it out, okay? No, I told them to lie, so it's on me. There was a bit of an asymmetry in the room. This side, there was only 4 or 5 people that got it right. Everybody else was wrong. And this side, only 4 people were wrong. Almost everybody else was right. So why was this side of the room so much better at deception detection than you guys? Like, what's the deal? Why is this side better? Pardon?
It's easier to tell the truth.
If it was easier to tell the truth, I don't know why would that matter for the deception detection rate?
It tells when you're lying. If the person is telling the truth, it's harder to fake a lying tell.
So shouldn't you have been more? You guys should have been more
It
accurate.
might be easier to recognize the truth.
They might have assumed that we were telling the truth in the first place because they weren't told otherwise, right?
Say again?
They were all assuming we were telling the truth because they had no idea what.
That is the answer. It's called the truth bias. It is the single largest and only reliable effect in deception detection studies. Okay? It is the only reliable effect, and it's very powerful. The truth bias, some would argue, is the foundation of language. Okay? In order to use language in the way that we humans evolved it, we have to assume that our partner is a cooperative partner. And so you look at Gracian sort of philosophy of language, you have to assume this other person is being cooperative. Otherwise, the way we use language with implicature and inference simply ceases to work. Yes?
Do politicians think the same way?
Aha! Politicians are very interesting. So we always trust other people. That's our default state, unless there is something that causes us to become suspicious, right? And so when somebody, like a politician, for example, has broken that trust, it's very difficult for them to regain it. And they're not just politicians either. And politicians, as we'll talk about, are in a very difficult place with lying. They often can't say the truth, what they really believe, or they won't get elected. You know, deplorables would be the most recent example, or Mitt Romney's 47% comment. Speaking actually very truthfully gets you not elected. And if you lie, you can go to jail. You could also get not elected because people don't want to elect dishonest people. So they're in a tricky spot. But this truth bias is the only effect that we see in every single deception detection study. And this, we're talking about 55 years of research now. Okay? Very powerful effect. Now, what did you guys rely on to tell if you were being lied to or told the truth? What were some of the signals or cues you use?
The level of specificity of the details.
Okay, so detail, specificity, more specificity, more likely to be truthful?
If I remember the studies correctly, it's the reverse of that, but I'm not remembering them.
Okay.
Specificity is a sign in police interrogations, for example, of lying.
Over specificity?
Yeah, I believe that that's what the data is.
No. I would say no. But you're right that specificity matters, but it also depends in the police context on the interrogation type. Yeah. Yes. Eye movement. All right. Yes. Very common response. Yeah. What else? Blinking. So blinking with the eyes. Yeah. What else? What do you guys tell if somebody's lying to you or not?
Well, as you know, I mean, it turns out she's married to me. So she said she went to the beach. I said, no, you didn't.
That is, so that's outside information, contextual information. And as I'll argue at the end of the talk, if you want to tell if somebody's lying, that is how you tell if somebody's lying. All these cues that we're talking about, for humans to tell if people are lying, almost never work. So although there are three main sort of ways that we assess deception, there's verbal, that's the details that you mentioned, nonverbal, blinking in the eyes, and physiological, which is heart rate, gut vaccine response. There's been a number of meta-analyses, two major ones looking across those 55 years of research, hundreds of studies, thousands of trials, and there is no Pinocchio's nose, right? So there is no, I mean, if you use a polygraph machine, you have a highly trained polygrapher, and they use a particular kind of technique called the guilty knowledge test. So that's where you know something, and only the guilty person could know that. You can get up to 70% accuracy. That's the best, and that's the reason why lie detectors are not permitted in US courts of law. Most lie detectors are not used for the guilty knowledge test. They're called the control question test, like, what's your name? My name's Jeff. You know, where do you live? I live in Palo Alto. Did you kill her? No. That's usually the way they're done, and those are pretty much at chance. Yes?
fMRI seems to be able to light up parts of the brain when you're...
Yeah, fMRI is super awesome for theoretical work. Like, I'm really excited. We have colleagues at Stanford that are doing this neuroscience, but it will never be a lie detection system. Yeah, and we can talk much more about that. Yeah, it's just so, it's about measuring hemodynamic movement in the brain, and our thoughts are one thing that move around blood in the brain, but our bodies do a lot more. So we can talk more about that.
So I go on and watch television more than I should, and they got lie detection as part of the plot, detectors and this other stuff. So
Yeah.
is that all bullshit? I mean, if you're a police officer, you
Yeah.
need to go on and figure this stuff out too.
Yeah. So one of my favorite studies by my friend Tim Levine, and I'll share this CNN link. We did a big project with CNN that just came out this week, I was telling you, and he's one of the people in it, and he did a great study in 2010. So you know the show Lie to Me? Have people heard about this, like Lie to Me? He took people that watch Lie to Me regularly and people that never watched it and had them do a classic deception detection task in which people, by the way, the average in all the meta-analyses, both of them came to the same number, is 54% accuracy. That's how we do in deception detection. The Lie to Me people that watched it all the time were around 41%. And the people that had never seen it before, guess what they performed? 54%. Almost all of my studies, and when I get people to try and tell if somebody else is lying to them, you can do it in chat, you can do it face-to-face, over the phone. Guess what they perform at? 54%. So this is significantly better than chance. But you don't want to, people relying on that too much. It's effectively chance. Why is 4% there? Debate in the literature, it's a controversy we don't know. One possibility is there are wizards, so there are some people, very few, that are very good at detecting deception. I'm skeptical about that, but it's a possibility. The other, which I think is more likely, is there are transparent liars. So those are people that, like, when they lie, they give off all the stereotypical cues. They blink a lot more. Their eyes go weird. They blush. But there's very few of them. And so when we talk about those cues, it's really interesting because another great study asked people in 77 different countries, what's the number one cue that you rely on to tell somebody's lying? The number one cue around the world is the eyes. And the eyes for humans are unreliable. They are not predictive of deception. Now, you can do things like the cognitive load interview technique, where you load people up, you get them to tell you what happened, and then tell it backwards, for example. Under those circumstances, you see more blinking. But humans can't detect it. You have to film it and run it through some machine learning. Yeah.
Can't you answer the question you just posed fairly easily by having a large pool of people all survey another large pool of people and see where the 54% breaks down? You either got the outliers on this side or that side or neither.
Happy to talk with you offline. We've looked at this a lot, and if you think you've got a solution for it, great. And I'm guessing not, but it would be awesome to find out. Because it's a joint problem, right? So we'll think through it. It's non-independent. It's non-independent, right? Because you have possibly transparent and detectors. And yeah. But I would love to talk to you about it because it'd be great to resolve that. So the number one thing afterwards when I give these talks in general is like, other people come up and be like, yeah, but really, isn't it like, what about neurolinguistic programming? Or what about, I was reading about shrugging the shoulders or, crossing and leaning back. They all may be cues for a particular context, but there is no cue that will always indicate that you're lying across all contexts. And I'll show you some work we've done around using algorithms to detect fake reviews, for example. And we can detect fake reviews written by MTurkers really high, much like better than 80%. But then you take that same algorithm and use it to try and detect fake reviews written by employees of that hotel, and it drops down to about 60%. Go ahead.
I noticed in Yelp, there's some guys, for example, put out 1,500 reviews.
Uh-huh.
And I go on and figure, well, golly, it sure seems they might go out to eat an awful lot.
Yeah,
Or
it's like
out
out twice a day.
Chill. And then usually at the 1,500, they're not one-star reviews, they're five-star reviews.
Right.
So that seems to me to be indicative of probably pleasure.
It could be. It could be. Or the person likes food. All right. Carl.
What about poker tells?
Mm-hmm.
Has there been much studies on how accurate that can be?
Yeah. There have been a couple. It's difficult to do because there's so many different possibilities. Now with they show the cards with the professional players. I think there'll be more studies coming online. But right, if there was a cue, then everybody would know it. It's sort of like this arms race problem, right? Is that once you know what the cues are, especially if they're neurological. Now, don't get me wrong. People do give off cues in their face that they don't control, right? We do give off microexpressions. They do happen every once in a while. But microexpressions are not related to deception. You can give off a microexpression because you don't like that person and because you just told them, like, yeah, you'd love to have lunch with them. Or you can give off that microexpression for some other unrelated, non-deceptive related reason. Right? You have a headache or something else happens, right? So it's really a challenge, and I often fall into the trap of like looking for Pinocchio's nose when I'm doing my the computational work of looking for linguistic features of deception, which is what I do. So it's really hard to avoid the trap.
Yeah. You mentioned the neurolinguistic programming. Is that effective at all, or that isn't?
Total BS.
That's what I thought.
And to the degree, and oftentimes if you have somebody that's selling you a technique for detecting deception, the chances are that it's deceptive, right? Or that they're, yeah. So I've worked for the government a lot and helped them try to assess systems. I've built systems that try to get at this kind of thing. And it depends. Like if it's about like, look, I can tell you whether somebody's lying or not, and they don't have any training data or anything like that, then forget about it. But I do think that if we start thinking more in terms of like a specific context, you can model it. But it's highly context contingent, high variance. Okay, so I think to really think about the way technology and deception and trust are coming together with this sort of like the future is to look way back. We've evolved language for at least 50,000 years, probably longer. It's really hard, it turns out, to find out when we started talking. So it's at least 50. We have good evidence for 50, but it could be as far back as 450,000. There's some estimates come out recently. But if, let's say it's 50, then that means there's been about 100 billion humans that have evolved language for us at a minimum. And all those dudes have been talking and talking and talking and talking and evolving and evolving and evolving our cognitive systems, our emotional systems. And they've done that basically up until 5,000 years ago when writing is first invented, where nothing that they ever said was ever recorded, right? So they evolved in a totally recordless environment. So not one word of what any of those folks said, was recorded. Completely evanescent, gone. What's that? Yeah, in some ways. So 5,000 years ago, okay, so there's the first evidence of writing. It's not really until 500 years ago that there's mass writing with the printing press. It's not really until World War II that more people are literate in the world than are not, okay? So even until very recently, most humans never left one record of any communication that they had, okay? So we were really evolving in this space in which nothing was recorded. So we evolved language in a recordless environment. Now in the networked age, how many of you today have written something? Right? I mean, it's like, why even ask the question now? So in this room today, more communication was recorded than all of human prehistory, right? In one day by a small number of people. And I think that's why we're seeing all these scandals in particular happening. I think it's part of the reason why trust in institutions is declining, because we're actually getting to see the communication that takes place within the institutions that we didn't before. And so we're seeing some real dramatic changes in the way we trust one another. But it also has some cool things for people like me and other computational social scientists, because now all those lies are being recorded, and often digitally in ways that can be analyzed. So you'll recall the online review thing. We've been talking about it a bit. Let me show you two. One of these my research group bought for $1 from a Turker. And the other one we pulled off of Hotels.com, which is a verified review site. So you have to pay for the hotel room before you can write the review. Certainly possible for it to be fake, but we estimate that the chances are well less than 1%. So one of them is real. One of them is fake. Your job is to decide now which one is fake. And let's see if we can beat the 54%. All right, how many people think A is fake? Okay. A is fake. About half. How many people think B is fake? More people say B. Okay, it's probably 2/3, right? Like 65%. Well done. Well done, ACM. Okay, so why is B fake? For those of you that got it right. Go ahead.
The number of exclamation points and all uppercase.
So it turns out punctuation is a cue. In our algorithm, it was ranked as one of the highest cues. All caps is not one of them, but punctuation is.
It's over the top.
Yeah, so the tone is also a big one. So positive adjectives in this case was a strong feature. When we ask people to do negative fake reviews, they overdo the negative adjectives as well. Yes?
They are also using the full name James Chicago Hotel. If it comes from someone who just went there, it usually just has a slang name like the James.
That's also an indicator. So that people that were faking it tended to refer to the hotel more often, the name.
They wanted to make a point that it was my husband and I.
Yeah. So also referring to the people that are in it. So self-referencing, in particular, first person singular, me, myself, and I, way up in the fake reviews. And we think that's partly because they're trying to put themselves into the review.
I think it's very generic. Like the other one said that walking distance to some places, this you could say of any hotel.
Yep. Also very good. So when a human body enters a space, there's a lot of cognition that takes place called embodied cognition that is tracking things that are going on at an unconscious level. And it turns out when you write about spaces you've been in, you write about them differently, and particularly use, for example, more prepositions.
Now you taught us how to write fake reviews.
Right, so we built one of those, and you know, I can tell you lots of stories about that, but then the question is like, well, can't you then just fake it? And so what we did is we trained people to beat our algorithm, which is called Review Skeptic. And those people end up writing really weirdly, and you put another algorithm on top of that, and you detect that. So it's very difficult. What I think is happening is it's difficult to act normal. So what the liar here, the Turker in this case, is trying to do is approximate somebody that stayed there. And they do a really good job. You guys were 65%. When we did it in the lab, on this particular set of data, it was 58%. So they're doing a really good job. They fooled a good number of humans, but they don't do it perfectly. Yes?
So what interests me about them not doing perfectly, if I were going to write fake reviews, I would go online, I'd download the reviews from other hotels and replace the name of the place in it. And
those are easy to detect, though, that just use plagiarism algorithms. Yeah. So we basically do that right off the bat to make sure our MTurkers didn't do that, because those are pretty easy to do. But a lot of the companies that support the review structures for most of these companies, right, like Bazaar Voice, for example, which runs most people's reviews, they're doing that work. Yeah. So they have plagiarism detectors as the first cut, and if you plagiarize, you're unlikely to see them. Other places like Craigslist, it's a real problem, because that's what they do is they'll just take a house listing, run it again, all the same numbers. And so in that case, where you don't have computational protection, that's precisely what the fakers do. Yeah.
There's somebody like Amazon,
Yeah.
which obviously is one of the major sources of reviews in the world.
Yeah.
There is a consequence to reading a collection of reviews. So outliers become much more obvious, I would argue.
Yeah, I mean, Amazon's been working really hard to try and improve the sort of info viz of reviews. So they're providing much more information that's aggregated across the reviews. And outliers can be, but they're also a part of a typical honest reviews produce a J distribution. And the reason for that is for most services and products, people like them a lot. But there's a few people that really don't. So you see very few 3s, for example, and you see some 1s and 2s. And part of that's probably motivation, like you're not going to go online and be like, it's okay, right? Usually it's like, this thing's awesome, or a few people say this really sucks. It's just a characteristic of the real ones. So it's not that if it doesn't have a J that it's definitely fake, but there's something going on there. The most powerful and the reason that people are that are on the platform have the best access is that you can also add network analyses to these. Were there any bursts in reviews? So bursts are associated with bots or the purchasing of reviews. So there's a number of ways you can go out. We focus on the language because I'm a psychologist, but our group has also looked at a lot of other sort of parameters, and they do seem to be pretty successful. All right, I better move on because we're getting a little late, but I'll just talk about one topic here that I know you guys are somewhat interested in. So this is the project that came out in CNN Tech and CNN Money yesterday. Carl will share the thing. We haven't. Oh, Tom was the one who did it? Okay, so there's 4 or 5 videos that goes over different aspects of it, like why politicians need to lie, how trust works. None of them. Mine is about this. I did an op-ed about a little bit of a puzzle. And I'll just tell you really quickly. Deception in presidential elections, though it seems really bad right now, is nothing new, okay? Here's 2, and they're old. They're pre-social media, pre-Twitter, pre-narcissism increase. Missile gap, fairly big lie. He lied about whether the Russians were going to have more missiles than the U.S. Okay, and clear. History allows us to mark these very clearly. Vietnam, perhaps even bigger, will not send American boys over to Vietnam. And they already had plans in place to do exactly that. These are big lies, okay? And sometimes we're like, I wish we could go back to the 60s and have like some real honest presidential elections, you know? But one thing that is different about this election is the degree to which Donald Trump, the frequency with which he makes false statements. So I'm going to talk about politics. I'm going to be upfront with you guys. I'm Canadian. I can't vote. I don't have the honor of voting. But as you know, Canadians are a little bit more liberal. Like you guys are still worried about health care and stuff like that. But I'm going to just be upfront with you because I could have liberal bias that I don't see. But I'm just going to look at some numbers. Most of these data are collected by fact checkers that are independent from my group. So there may be some people in here that are strongly in favor of one or the other. That's fine, and we can talk about that after the talk. I think that's important that we do that. But we're going to try and treat this sort of scientifically, okay? So this is the end of September, and his, from mostly false on down, is 70% of his statements were false. And Hillary Clinton was at around 27%, so that's a really big difference. One concern then was maybe the fact checkers are biased, so we can compare against his Republican primary competition. The top 4, Rubio and Cruz and whoever else, those 4 guys. Kasich and Bush, 20% was their average. Romney and McCain both were 24 and 26%, respectively. So he's like 2 to 3 times higher than Republicans either. So even if there's liberal bias baked into the fact checking, he's 2 standard deviations higher than most. And Clinton tends to be fairly typical for a politician. Okay. Here's the puzzle. This is the same time as I got those fact-checking numbers. This is poll taken September 19th to 22, before the October surprises. But they're still roughly the same. That's 38% is how many people think he's honest and trustworthy. And for Clinton, it's 36%. Okay? So we see 2 to 5 times more false statements by one candidate, but they're considered basically equally honest. Okay? Now, why might that be? There's a number of reasons. One is that fact-checking doesn't matter. buy that. But fact-checking at the scale we're doing it is relatively new. And it may be that the electorate's not quite used to like integrating fact-checking yet. But it is true that as his lies or his false statements go up, his numbers do go down. So there is a correlation. It's just like high, like the baseline is high. Another possibility is what we're called homophily effects. So very old effect. We like and trust people that look like us. Okay, you can imagine evolutionary reasons for why that would be. But you know, he's a white male, and we're seeing huge demographic shifts for white males away from Clinton and towards Trump. We're seeing record numbers of women voting for Clinton. And it could have to do with topical stuff, but it's also consistent with sexism and racism, right? And I'm not saying that as like one group is bad or worse. I'm just saying that that's a human tendency, a very deep and old one. And that could be driving it. Communication style. Trump is amazing in his communication style. He's super direct. He's very emphatic, and he speaks in simple and powerful language, and his nonverbals are like that as well. Clinton, on the other hand, is much more qualified, speaks in much more complex language, takes long time to answer, and often doesn't help herself, right? So one time she was asked by an interviewer, "Can we trust you?" And any normal human says, "Yes." And her answer was long. It was about 4 sentences, right? That is not good for conveying trustworthiness. So her communication style could be hurting as well. There's a major distrust in institutions now. And this distrust is at least 10 years old. It's distrust in government, it's distrust in church, it's distrust in the media. Most institutions in America are at very 10-year lows. And so Clinton's a politician, she's part of an institution, and she may be bumping up against that distrust level. But I think there's... well, it may, but in the Gallup polls I've been looking at, the trust has declined at the 10-year low for the last 10 years. It's flattened out. Yes? Yes. No, they also take a hit too. They've taken a hit too, yeah. And that's a large concern for corporations, actually. Yeah. But none of these explanations fully account for our puzzle. Remember, our puzzle is that their trustworthiness is the same, but one person says false statements at a far higher rate. So I think the answer is that Trump is a bullshitter, okay? And it turns out bullshit is a technical term, and it's first coined by this philosopher at Yale, Harry Frankfurt. It's a small little book, more like a pamphlet. You know in this book, good. Go back and read it. It's a lovely little book. Gets a little heavy in the middle, but it's not very long, so you can deal with the heaviness for a while. And he argues that lies are not bullshit. Bullshit is not lies. Okay, so in lying, you'll remember, a liar is trying to convince somebody of something that's not true. A bullshitter, it doesn't matter about truth or not truth, right? It's independent. I could draw from the truth. I don't care about the truth, right? That's right. The key there is there's just no commitment to the truth. It may be part of it, it may not. That's not what's important. What's important instead is the message, right? So you build your story around whatever message you want to convey. So the classic canonical example is a fisherman. He tells this great story of catching this fish that was like this big. And whether it's this big or this big is actually nothing to do with the story. It's that it's exciting and there's suspense and everybody wants to hear about the big fish, including the audience, right? The audience isn't like, yeah, but let's get the ruler out and measure it. And so you can think about in Trump's case, almost all of his lies are related, and I'm going to say lies now because it's easier than saying false statements, which is really long. But all of them are related to his messages. So, you know, unemployment is its highest levels ever, and our trade agreements are the worst ever, and all that. And they're demonstrably false, but they're consistent with the message of people feeling left behind. Crime rates are up. You go down to the urban center cores, you will get shot, right? Those are all, that's false too. You know, here in downtown Sunnyvale, we're not likely to get shot. Same with downtown Chicago. Like, yes, murder rates are high in Chicago, but, you know, it's an exaggeration. But it fits with a narrative of law and protection. Or the big one is like the wall, right? So we're going to build a wall. It's going to be beautiful, go across the whole border, and Mexico will pay for it. And no entity has said that that's feasible. Nobody thinks that that is actually feasible. But it doesn't matter, right? What matters is the message we have to be strong and stop illegal immigration. It'll be huge, right? It'd be so huge, it's pretty much impossible. So another way to put this is a great piece in The Atlantic that I will summarize in this way that I think really captures it is the press and liberals take Trump literally, but not seriously. And his supporters take him seriously, but not literally. Right? But I want to point out one other thing about bullshit that Frankfurt says here, which is why. So the production of bullshit is stimulated whenever a person's obligations or opportunities to speak about some topic are more excessive than his knowledge of the facts that are relevant to that topic. And the reason I think this is a better explanation than, say, he's a narcissist or a psychopath or any of those, which I think is dangerous for psychologists to say because we don't know. But Trump is very upfront about being an outsider, right? It's part of his identity. He will say, I don't prep like she does for debates. And so he doesn't have as much command as other politicians about these. And when that happens, when you're asked, I mean, if I were to try to answer any of the Chris Wallace questions from last night, I would do horribly, right? You have to be extremely well versed in this kind of stuff to be able to speak for 2 minutes in front of millions of people knowledgeably. He does an amazing job for probably not knowing that much, right? Like, he can do it for 2 minutes. It's after 70 minutes, it starts to wear, and you can tell he doesn't perform very well in the second half. And that's because he has to engage in more bullshit, I think. And I think it's a non-personality assessment. I'm not making any personality assessment about him at all. Just like, it makes sense if you are characterizing yourself as sort of like not strong on policy. Yeah.
2 items. Scott Adams talks about Trump as the master persuader. And he says, I'm a hypnotist and I can see all those things coming out there. That's one observation. But the other one is we use metaphors all the time in our language. Every third sentence has a metaphor in it, typically. And this is just what we accept as part of communications. It's all metaphorical talk.
Yeah, I mean, so Trump is a master persuader. I mean, he's the Republican nominee. It's insane and amazing, right? Like, he's like no other nominee in recent history. So there's no question he's an extremely persuasive individual. And people that don't recognize that are in trouble, basically. And I think that was a lot of the Republican primary opposition. In terms of language being metaphorical, yes. I mean, most of our language starts as metaphor and then dies and becomes sort of dead metaphor. So you're sitting on chair legs, right? So yes, that's very common. But what Trump's really good at is ambiguity. He uses and relies on the ambiguity of language to deny things. So when he says, I won't concede the race if I lose. And today he's saying, like, obviously I won't. If it's a close election and something looks funny, I'm not going to in advance concede it. And so he's using that ambiguity that's natural in language. Question is, like, are some kinds of bullshit better than others?
I would say, like, there was expression like people believe more often in the big lie instead of just a lie. So does it work? Is it correct or it's just common misconception?
It's a good question. I mean, the biggest bullshit right now, I think, is that the election is rigged. And the reason for that is that it's a huge lie, I think, right? There's very little evidence of fraud. Now, it could be media bias, it could be those things, but actual electoral fraud, very little evidence. But there's one thing Frankfurt says is that BS is much more dangerous than lies because you can counter lies with facts. And BS you can't. And on my way over, I was listening to NPR, and they were interviewing some people in North Carolina, and they asked a room of people, like, do you think the election will be rigged and that there will be voter fraud? And every single person raised their hand. Right? So that's a big lie. Like, that is like cornerstone democracy level lie. And so, yeah, I think that, I don't know if they're better than smaller ones or believed more, but they matter. Let me leave you with one fun thing then to end the night. So this great book comes out, I think it came out last year, 2015, and I got it because I was interested in this, and I'm reading through, and I swear to God, this is in the book and is a synonym. So he basically catalogs every single synonym of bullshit that he can find, and then does the etymology, so goes back and finds out the origin and things like that. Here is one of them. Not kidding. Just a little humor to add for the day. What does trumpery mean? Trickery and scamming. That was its sort of meaning in the 1400s, so the first use is somewhere mid-1400s. And it changes over time to sort of general nonsense and trivial insignificance. And when the CNN piece came out on Monday, was a trending hashtag now, Trumpery. So, yeah. Some of you asked though, like, how do we tell if somebody's lying? Did anyone remember Columbo? That's how you tell if somebody's lying, right? You ask questions, you know some other details that are inconsistent with what the person's telling you. And yes, technology has created ways for us to lie that we've never thought about before and made it easier, and we can do it at scale. But it's also provided tools that can allow us to search for information and find out context in ways that we've never been able to do before. And so I think we're in a really fascinating time of flux in the way we lie and trust each other, and technology is playing a really fascinating role, but not a one-dimensional one. Thank you guys all so much for your attention. I really appreciate it. It's been fun.